Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewitz, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyze and Adapt, where I see if a video game would work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop, as in board and card games, tabletop roleplay, like Dungeons and Dragons, and finally, as a Larp. Today we're doing something different, and very special for the last episode of this season. We're taking a look at an educational game for kids. We're taking a look at Zoombinis. For those of you who don't know, Zoombinis is an educational puzzle game first released in 1996. It's a game about making a group of these little blue creatures and guiding them on their journey to their new home, navigating puzzle-based hazards as they do so. I remember playing this as a kid and having a blast, and as an adult I can say that it still holds up today. Maybe it's the nostalgia talking, but I don't think that's the case. Other games that I enjoyed as a kid I no longer find appealing. But Zoombinis was one of those games with a timeless aspect that's difficult to quantify. While the sound quality isn't amazing and the graphics are obviously 2D, the animations and quirky characters are an absolute joy to watch and listen to than many other AAA titles today. I don't know if it's made me any smarter as an educational game, but it's the game that got me interested in computers and video games in the first place. The only thing holding me back from recommending the re-release version on Steam are the reported glitches and bugs that make it impossible to finish in some areas. I've personally never run into them myself, but if you do plan on getting the game, be sure to do your research first. Anyways, I'm not here to talk about Zoombinis or reminisce specifically about them. I'm here to analyze and adapt them into a different medium. So keeping in the theme of an educational game for kids, I'll try to think up a tabletop game for just that purpose. To begin with, there are a ton of different games we can do that with Zoombinis due to how many levels and puzzles there are in the video game. We could in theory base the board game directly off one of the levels individually, but I feel that would be a cop-out and make this section a bit too short. So instead, I'm going to try and adapt the idea of the logical journey onto the board itself. By the end of this, I'm hoping we'll have a large sprawling map, crawling with tokens, Zoombinis, and other plastic pieces. To begin with, adapting this game to the board in a one-to-one way can work, but it would require 2 people to play despite the single-player focus of the video game. The reason being is the hidden information factor. Take the pizza troll level for example. In that level, the titular pizza troll blocks the path forwards, and to advance, you, the player, have to make the troll the perfect pizza. Unfortunately for us, the troll's idea of the perfect pizza is randomized every time you visit them. To determine what the perfect pizza is, we could have the player draw from a deck of cards. Each card would have a single pizza with each card having their own unique variation of toppings on it. The problem with this method is, when I make the pizza, the only way to check if I got it right or not is to check the card, which would then of course reveal the answer. We could change how this works with any number of card drawing variations, with only individual ingredients on each card, but once again, doing it this way would reveal more information than the video game itself would. To that end, we need a second player who picks out the ingredients and then hides them. At that point, they'd accept or reject the pizzas as required. The way it'd be played reminds me a bit of how the Mastermind board game would play out, and in that sense we could make it 2-player in that both players are playing pizza trolls and Zoombinis at the same time. Moving on from that, the board would have splitting paths just like in the video game, with the players moving their Zoombinis one space at a time to progress. Each space would have a corresponding game attached to it. Said games would come on foldable boards, some larger than others based on the puzzles they represented. Besides the solutions, which are determined before the game even starts, there shouldn't be any random elements to the game, and the second player who runs the puzzle elements essentially doesn't have any decision-making options. All they would do is say what is or isn't right. That said, if we go the mastermind route that I mentioned previously, the decision-making they'd actually make is what the solution is. They determine what it is, which would take away some of the random elements of the game, which can be good or bad depending on how you look at it. Moving on, if we really wanted to make this a true multiplayer Zoombinis games for kids, I'd keep the following criteria in mind. First and foremost, it'd have to be educational. Now I don't think it has to teach the kids anything new specifically, but victory has to be determined by intelligence at the very least. Second, it has to be simple and easy to grasp. Lastly, but no less important, it has to have Zoombinis. Here's the thing though, just because it's a multiplayer game doesn't mean it has to be competitive. I imagine that there would still be a single large board with various tiles, all leading to the end. Each tile would represent a puzzle which players would work together to solve using physical pieces. For example, one such puzzle could involve a series of ropes or strings attached or wrapped around a single pole, with each player controlling a single string. One puzzle might involve a series of interlocking blocks, with each player controlling one of those blocks, with the limitation that they can only move their blocks in one of two directions. Some puzzles would only have one answer, and because of this, the replayability value might be lessened. And of course, there are only so many props you can fit into a box before it becomes inhibitive. To that end, there would be multiple puzzles that use and recycle the same materials to stretch things out. If this was a game designed for educational purposes, we could always have it in a school setting with the teacher playing host, dividing the classes into teams. In that case, we could change the puzzles into brain teasers and questions. It'd be less of a board game and more of a trivia style affair then. With multiple groups, each represented by a Zoombini, the teacher could then draw a map on the board and turn things into a race. Each group would take turns answering questions, with wrong answers having the Zoombinis stay in one place. The teams could opt to answer harder questions to move multiple spaces instead of one. Once every team has had their turns in answering questions, we could have a puzzle round where every team gets to participate at the same time, with the fastest puzzle solver moving their Zoombinis first. Due to the nature of classrooms and schools, it's entirely possible that they'd have sports equipment as well that could be improvised and used for the purposes of certain puzzles as well. So instead of having all the tools in a box and marketed as a board game, Zoombinis could also be a games kit, a set of rules and such. After the round of questions and the physical puzzle games, classes could resume and another round of Zoombinis could be played again or saved for another day, giving the players and students something to look forwards to in the future. Now, with that all said, I believe I've only just made a Zoombinis branded educational game, not a true Zoombinis game. So with that in mind, let's see if we can have more luck in the next medium. Character creation is an interesting beast in most tabletop RPGs, and is sometimes seen as the best part of the hobby by some people. Some systems require the player to roll dice to determine their stats. Others ask players to choose one of several options, while others give them a resource to spend on said options, allowing them to take several cheaper ones or a small amount of expensive ones. Some RPGs have a mix of those mechanics or all of them at the same time. Zoombinis' character creation in that regard is all aesthetic until it isn't. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the video game, all Zoombinis, regardless of appearance, perform exactly the same. They move at the same speed, they have the same amount of endurance, and from what I can tell, the same amount of strength as well. However, this strange puzzle world in which they inhabit cares about how they look. A blue nose shouldn't do anything different from a red one, but if the puzzles care, then so do the mechanics. On the surface level, the game seems to teach children that you should judge people on their appearances, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, but either way, as a role-playing game, it does mean that we won't have any traditional party roles, at least none that are mechanically enforced. In a classic fantasy-based RPG, the knight would be the protector of the group, the wizard the smart one, for example. The actual game for me comes down to making a series of puzzles, half of which are based on the characters' appearances, and letting the party work together to find a solution. Based on that alone, it's not too different from the board/card game portion of this video, making this kind of redundant if we go this path. So how would we distinguish it from the board/card game version, if at all? Well, for one, the group size would be more limited in size, which for Zoombinis isn't always good. The second difference would be the roleplay, which is a bit difficult to wrap my head around. We know that their motivations from the video game is to escape their doomed home to find a new one, making a journey through various dangerous areas as they do so. That said, it's not all bad news. Due to the way that the Zoombinis operate, we know that they have all the reasons to work together as a group, and none of the reasons to separate, at least willingly. For me, when I host a tabletop RPG game, I try to either start the game with all the players knowing each other and being friends, or having them start as part of the same organization. While also viable, I rarely have the party randomly get caught up in the same circumstances or disaster together. In the Zoombinis video game, it's kind of implied that all three options happen at the same time. They likely already know each other, and they're obviously part of the same group, while they're trying to escape and are thus caught up in the same disaster. Going back to the original idea of this adaptation, I want this to be an educational experience for kids. So having the character creation be as simple as picking out parts for their characters' appearances fits well for me. In the video game and board/card game, all the puzzles have a specific solution with specific answers. In a tabletop setting, powered more by imagination, I can see players coming up with solutions not before seen in any game. For example, one of the earlier puzzles asks the players to move through a series of caves in the video game up a set of stairs, but the Guardians don't like certain body types and colors and will stop anyone from entering through specific stairs if they try. A Zoombini with a spring could jump over these stairs up an alternate route, and the ones with helicopter legs could just hover over them if this was a slightly more realistic setting. In fact, we'd have to figure out how all the legs would work in certain circumstances. For the sake of simplicity, we'll just say players can roll 2 dice to determine how they traverse certain obstacles, ignoring balance for the time being. Normal feet would only ever roll 2 dice no matter the circumstance. Ones with wheels would roll 3 on flat surfaces, but 1 dice on bumpier ones, for example. As this is a team activity, we'd still need puzzles and obstacles that require the entire party to solve. I don't know about you, but tabletop RPGs tend to get people thinking of solutions even if it's not an actual puzzle that's supposed to be solved. And even if they do have a certain solution, I've seen players come up with something that breaks it entirely. I've seen players turn combat encounters into puzzles, nondescript closed doors into puzzles, puzzles into bigger puzzles that had simple solutions otherwise. Point is, players, by their very nature, will overthink things. Or maybe that's just my group. If nothing else, it'll help the players all come closer as friends. Jolly cooperation, as they might say. In other words, even if it doesn't teach the players anything, it'll at least teach them the value of teamwork. With the idea more or less sorted, let's journey to the final medium of Larp. So let's start this analysis by looking at what happens when you reach 0 hit points and what happens from there. In some LARPs you might simply die and that's that. In others you black out and if left alone eventually die. Sometimes there are ways to resurrect you and sometimes there are not. Point is, it's different in every game. Zoombinis as characters, however, don't ever seem to actually die. Now, to be clear, not all LARPs have death in them either. Some don't even have combat at all. But it's clear to me that Zoombinis at the very least can suffer injury or get mild dizzy spells. For all their childlike nature, Zoombinis are very tough little customers. Hitting 0 hit points, or the game's closest equivalent, would just send the player to a recovery state. In my head, other players could help them up and place them in medical areas to recover faster, prompting and rewarding teamwork. In the board/card game section, I mentioned setting up puzzles for kids to solve using sports equipment, rope and such. In that regard, I don't see much difference here except for one thing: the NPCs and the journey itself. While schools require classes to at least be somewhat ordered so that grades can be judged, which I know isn't always possible, LARP on the other hand doesn't have to even try. The only passing grade in the end is if everyone's having fun and if they solve the puzzle. Instead of splitting everyone up into smaller groups to solve a puzzle, we can instead make a gauntlet of puzzles to hem their progress with NPCs to help or hinder them as required. To that end, it can be set up much the same way as an escape room, only with more outdoor areas. The base concept would remain the same though. To progress, one must get past the various obstacles using their minds. Besides that is the kit, equipment, and things they'd wear. In fantasy-based LARPs, you're likely to find hood-wearing mages, leather-belted rogues, and steel-plated knights. In Zoombinis, they have sunglasses, roller skates, and no hands. We can't really do all that on a practical level, but let's try to analyze and adapt it regardless. The headwear, eyes, and noses are fairly straightforward in my mind as far as LARPing goes. Actual headgear and makeup are pretty straightforward, and prosthetics, like single eyeballs, would be one-way goggles made to look like a single eye. In the end, the only thing I'd have a problem with are the roller skates. If one person had to wear roller skates, then they'd need to wear the safety gear, and if they wore safety gear, just about everyone else in close proximity to the roller skates would have to do as well, meaning it'd limit the options of what they could and couldn't wear on their heads. Not only that, but having wheels in your feet isn't conducive to standing still and puzzle solving. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly possible, but it doesn't make it any easier. Helicopter and spring feet are also a no-go, even if we ignore the danger of those parts getting caught on something. Now we could have little symbols on the player's legs representing their different leg parts, though I'm unsure if they'd be aesthetic or not. Moving on to something more interesting in my eyes is the lack of arms. I'm a firm believer in that limitations breed creativity. If the players aren't allowed to use their arms or hands for the purposes of puzzle solving, then many of the puzzles could only be done with the help of others. Many legs make light work, as they might say. This also gives us a unique side effect of having technically more restrictive puzzles without actually having to make the puzzles themselves more restrictive. The more restrictive they are, the more predictable the solutions become, and thus easier for the organizers to manage. That said, I wouldn't bind the hands of the participants. I can easily see them losing balance and hurting themselves, for example. The organizers would have to keep an eye out for people using their hands to complete the puzzles, but it's either that or a higher chance of injury. Keeping in mind that the participants in this case would be children. Now that I say it out loud, I'm practically describing a puzzle camp of some sort. Personally, I remember doing something similar as a child, attending a day camp while solving puzzles. I remember coming into a dry forest area with various ropes and playground equipment and spending hours there with the adults taking us from activity to activity. It's not exactly the same Zoombinis logical journey that I'd imagine, but the idea is already there. Now that I think about it, despite it being called a camp, there was no actual camping done when I went. No tents, no fire, nothing like that. I felt kind of ripped off, to be honest. So that's my analysis of Zoombinis and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the game yourself, and if so, how did it go? Comment, like, and subscribe, and maybe, just maybe, we'll come back to the subject sometime in the future. My name is Freebiewitz, and thank you for watching the final episode of Season 1. I look forward to seeing you all again in Analyse and Adapt Season 2.